Super Nintendo Chalmers?
Hello and welcome to Growing Up Gaming, the internet's second hottest news show according to someone who's an authority on hot news shows on YouTube. I am Greg Stewart. This series is a series where I talk about, well, so far I've been talking about different game consoles and sort of what they meant to me, my memories of getting them, owning them, playing them, what they meant to me, and also a bit of a, if it makes sense, a little bit of discussion about if they affected my career. Of course, I went on to a career in games media and then games development, and then got out of games, doing game podcasting and retro gaming YouTube content, stuff like that. So anyway, first few episodes we've covered the 2600, the NES, the Game Boy, and of course, the almighty Sega Genesis. So now it's time to talk about the Super Nintendo. Now, I did not own a Super Nintendo right away. If you watched the previous episode, you'll know that I was a Nintendo kid. The NES was kind of where my love for gaming came from. But I also kind of got sick and tired of waiting for Nintendo to finally release their Super Nintendo. And was lured by the siren song of Sega and the Genesis. And so by 1991 had purchased my own Sega Genesis and was building my library for that when the Super Nintendo was released. So being, how old was I when that happened? 14, 15 years old. I had some money, but I didn't have the money to go out and buy a new video game console, especially so soon after getting my Genesis. So I did not get a Super Nintendo right away. And I loved my Genesis, but I also, of course, wanted to play Super Nintendo. I was still a fan of Nintendo games, always had been. And luckily, my best friend at the time, Dave, he did hold out for a Super Nintendo, and he did end up getting a Super Nintendo. So I still had access to that system and its games pretty much from the start. Although I do remember when he first got his Super Nintendo, he and I were we'd had a bit of a falling out. And I think it's a weird thing to call it a falling out when you're talking about 15-year-olds, but we were in a rough patch in our friendship, and I don't think we were actively speaking to each other when the Super Nintendo came out. So luckily we made up. I'm not going to say that motivation wasn't partially because I wanted to play the Super Nintendo, but I mean the main motivation was that he was my best friend, and we made up because that's what you do. But luckily I made up with him in time to go up to his place and play his Super Nintendo when he got it. And so I don't remember exactly what games he had. I don't remember exactly what games we played on that first day. But I do remember kind of the earliest games I played on it. Of course, the first one was Super Mario World. Everybody had Super Mario World. It was a pack-in. I remember being pretty amazed by it. And in the moment, I'm sure I said, oh, this is the best Mario game I've ever played. And I mean, it's fair to say that it's the best Mario game up to that point. In subsequent years, I've definitely leaned back towards thinking that Mario 3 was actually a better game. I enjoyed that game a little bit more. But Mario World was beautiful. It was gorgeous. The colors and the resolution especially really popped on that game. So it left an impression. For me as a racing fan, obviously F-Zero had two things going for it. One, it was a racing game. And two, it was literally built from the ground up to be a showcase for the system and for sort of the graphical tricks you could do on the Super Nintendo, how fast it could move, the Mode 7 graphics, which looked like nothing I'd ever seen before in a racing game outside of an arcade machine, and even that. That game left an impression pretty quickly, right out of the gate. And I think that that was probably the game that early on that made me think, oh, I'd like to have a Super Nintendo at some point. Other early games I remember playing a lot of were The Legend of the Mystical Ninja, which to this day remains one of my favorite games. And I remember my experience playing Legend of the Mystical Ninja was the best possible experience, because as great as that game is as a single-player game, multiplayer is where it's at. It's meant to be played two-player, I think. and it plays so well as a 2-player game. And of course, I was always playing on my friend Dave's system, going up to his place and playing the Super Nintendo. So, you're not going to play a 2-player game and, the owner of the system just sit there and not play at all. So, yeah, the entirety of my experience with Legend of the Mystical Ninja when it was a new game was as a multiplayer game. Same thing with Joe and Mac. I remember Joe and Mac, Caveman Ninjas, being another game that we played pretty much right from the start. I don't have really strong memories of that game, but, it was definitely a game we played. And I do remember enjoying it just because the characters were really big. I kind of liked the setting. I think Bonk was already a thing at that point, but I hadn't really played Bonk because I didn't have a TurboGrafx, and I didn't really know anybody who had a TurboGrafx, or at least had one that bought a lot of games. But there were 2 games in particular that stood out outside of those ones that we played early on that I think, to me, really sort of personified the Super Nintendo experience, which I think is kind of a weird thing to say when we've already mentioned Mario World and F-Zero. But I think it has to do with the fact that, Mario World, while it is a great game, and while it was a great game, it really felt like a continuation of what we'd seen in Mario 3. And while it did use some of the sort of the graphical trickery that the Super Nintendo sort of had in the hardware, especially the scaling, rotation, Mode 7 stuff, and it did definitely show off some of the other advantages of the system as far as the audio and the colors and that sort of thing. In one of the very first worlds, you get faced with that gigantic bullet bill flying across the screen, which I'd say you hadn't really seen before. However, Super Mario 3, they'd actually managed to do a whole giant world. I think it was World 4, where you had giant Goombas and Koopas marching around the screen. But still, it was impressive looking. And I for some reason, I also equate a lot of the diagonal platforms that you saw in that game as being sort of indicative of playing on the Super Nintendo for some reason. But the 2 games that I remember playing that really felt like, these are Super Nintendo games. This is kind of what I'm expecting from this system. One was Super Castlevania 4 from Konami. I was a big Castlevania fan. The very first game I ever bought with my own money on the NES was Castlevania 2, which I think is unfairly maligned. But Castlevania 2 was one of the first games I ever bought with my own money, period, because I didn't buy my own Atari 2600 games. I'd gone back and played the original Castlevania. I'd played a bunch of Castlevania 3. I loved it when the Game Boy came out. I was a big fan of Castlevania Adventure. I was excited about Castlevania 4. And the weird thing is that thinking back on it, when I first played Castlevania 4, I hated it. It wasn't what I wanted. I wanted almost kind of what we got with Mario World, which was like a continuation of Castlevania 3. I remember leaving that game thinking Castlevania 3 was a better game. And I was so disappointed that that Castlevania 4 felt more like a throwback to the first game. Although I did appreciate the limp whip and being able to whip in every direction. That was a new thing for Castlevania games at that point. But also, I remember, while I liked the music, it wasn't enough to get past. I always felt that with Castlevania 4, they were really trying to go for a bit of an organic look. And it didn't work for me at that time. It just didn't do anything for me at all. I thought it looked messy. I thought it looked like there was just a bunch of colors on the screen that weren't really attractive, I guess, would be the best way to put it. So I remember, just not really digging that game at all. Weirdly enough, because again, now one of my favorite games. But back then when I played it, maybe it was my bias. Maybe I didn't want it to be great because I had a Genesis and I knew that I wasn't going to be playing Castlevania 4 on my own anytime soon. But the one thing that it did do is, at least it seemed to me, is that it really took advantage of a lot of the graphical tricks that the Super Nintendo was capable of. I mean, you got into that one room, I think it was by the time you got into the castle, where you had to whip up to one of the hangars, and the room would rotate around Simon, and then there was that hallway that had the rotating tunnel in the background. There were bosses, like the golem, that just got bigger and bigger and bigger as you attacked it. You had the Fred Astaire and Paula Abdul boss, which was, they were transparent. There's a lot of ghosts floating around in that level. You remember the chandeliers that you jump back and forth on, that which is these big rotating chandeliers. Like, it felt like this is what traditional platformers and the kind of action platforming games that I loved were going to look like moving forward. It was gimmicky, sure, and it wasn't perfect. There was a lot of slowdown and stuff like that, but it was still like, this is kind of what I was expecting from a 16-bit Nintendo system. And then the other game that kind of fit that bill was Super Ghouls and Ghosts. Now, again, I was a big Ghouls and Ghosts fan because I had recently gotten my Genesis, and Ghouls and Ghosts was one of the games that I had rented previously to buying the Genesis that really sold me on the system, because it looked very close to the arcade game. It played great. It's a classic. So Super Ghouls and Ghosts I was really excited for, and I remember really loving that game. But it was sort of along the same lines, because it felt like Ghouls and Ghosts, but with like a layer of polish that you were getting because it was on the Super Nintendo. Again, lots of transparencies. I remember like the shipyard level where you had all those ghosts floating around. You had the water, and then you get on the raft, and the waves are going up and down. There was the rotating tower level, I believe, which, again, thinking back on it, we had seen on the NES with was it Castellan and Battletoads, I think, also did use that trick. Even like in the early levels where the ground was I'll call it morphing. It wasn't really morphing, but the ground was shifting around you all the time. And then you got into the second half of that level where the water in the background there'd be a giant tidal wave that would rise up from the background and then crash onto the foreground and take away half the play field. Again, it felt like I'm playing Ghouls and Ghosts, but I'm playing it with all these this level of polish and all these graphical flourishes that I couldn't get before. Now, having said that, and playing that game for a while, and especially going back and playing it now, I preferred the original Ghouls and Ghosts, if only because you could fire your javelin or your weapons up and down, which you couldn't do in Super Ghouls and Ghosts for some weird reason, although Super Ghouls and Ghosts did add a double jump, which I thought was great. But yeah, if anyone was around at that time, you might remember, at least I remember, sort of part of the System Wars thing that was going on the playgrounds. You would have sort of Team Ghouls and Ghosts and Team Super Ghouls and Ghosts if those were games you were interested in, because I was always of the opinion, I think a lot of Genesis owners were, that Ghouls and Ghosts played better mainly because you could fire up and down, which you couldn't do in Super Ghouls and Ghosts. Sounds silly to say it now. It was kind of silly back then, but it was also the truth. Yeah, and then two more games that made a huge impression right from the start were Final Fight, because I was a big Final Fight fan. I played that anytime I saw Final Fight in the arcade, I would play it, and loved it. I loved beat-em-ups, and being able to play something like Final Fight that looked so close to what was in the arcade at home was a huge deal. Now, Final Fight was rightfully sort of dragged through the mud on the Super Nintendo because it was missing a player. It was missing Guy. Or if you're from up here, you might have referred to him as Guy because you knew a lot of French people, which is what I did. But it was missing Guy, and it was missing the two-player mode, which I don't think was the end of the world when you sort of had gotten the game, and the whole point was that it was like the new shiny, and you just wanted to play something that looked like the arcade. But the fact that if you had a Genesis or you knew someone with a Genesis and you had access to it, that Streets of Rage came out right around the same time. Streets of Rage didn't look as nice. The characters were a lot smaller, but the movesets were huge. It had 3 playable characters. It was 2 players simultaneous. It had great music, which I didn't realize until playing Final Fight for this episode, that the music in Final Fight on the Super Nintendo is not pretty. Streets of Rage was just such an objectively better game than Final Fight. Now, Final Fight was, I think, pretty old by the time it came out on the Super Nintendo, too. But either way, that kind of felt like a win when you were a Genesis kid. But I still enjoyed playing Final Fight a lot. Now, again, this is another game that I've gone back to. I went back to capture footage, which I'm sure is running over the screen right now, or will be in a moment, or has been in a few moments ago. Playing it today, I'm actually kind of surprised at how not great that port is. Now, that's with years of separation. It's not shiny and new anymore. The Sega CD version had come out at that point, which was much closer to the arcade version. It had an amazing Red Book soundtrack. And, I mean, since then, we've had Final Fight re-released across multiple platforms in pretty much arcade-perfect form, or you can play it on MAME. But I will say that, you know, back in 1991, nobody was sitting their Super Nintendo and a monitor right next to an actual Final Fight arcade machine and doing direct comparisons. So it was close enough. Again, it was just the glaring 2-player mode that was missing. The other game that, to me, made a great first impression, a huge first impression, and it had a lot to do with the music, which subsequently learning that it was a Yuzo Koshiro soundtrack, being a huge fan of his, because who isn't, made more sense, was ActRaiser. I remember turning on the Super Nintendo with ActRaiser in the cartridge slot for the very first time, and as the logo was spinning and warping into the screen, the music swells and it sounds like an orchestra. Throughout the whole game, it's like that. It's amazing composition. It sounds like you've got an orchestra playing, and I remember reading that in magazines, people saying, like, it sounds like there's a whole orchestra inside your Super Nintendo, and that was absolutely true. Even down to little things like when you were entering the fight scenes and you would start up a really zoomed out vision or image of the map, and then it would spin and scale in, and like you had the music going like da na 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 da na 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 da na na na, and then it would just like dun, and the screen would go black, and you just heard a little bit of horn at the end going like dun dun dun. It was so epic sounding. It was a great game, don't get me wrong. I still love it. I still play it. That's a game that I can pick up and play. I've played the first hour of that game probably 50 times over the years. But, man, the music added so much to that game. It was just incredible. And I'm still always amazed by it every time I turn it on. I'm always so impressed by how that game sounds. And it plays really well too. It's a shame about the sequel, although learning recently that the sequel was made artificially more difficult to avoid problems with rentals. What a shock in North America. So I'm going to check my notes here for just a minute. Oh, okay, sorry. So, sort of going along with the first impressions and going along with multiplayer games, I just saw another name here. I want to throw out 2 more early games that really made an impression for Super Nintendo, for me. One was Contra III. Again, an incredible, incredible game. Contra III, I think it's up there as the best Contra in my mind. My favorite Contra game for sure. Again, getting to play it 2 players. And it was so bombastic and such a step up from the original Contra. I had played a decent amount of Super C. I didn't play I played Operation C on the Game Boy. I didn't play whatever the third Contra game was on the NES. But my favorite up to that point was the first Contra game. And Contra III just felt like Contra on steroids. And again, using a lot of the systems, Mode 7. I remember getting to the scene where the plane flies in from the background and bombs the whole stage, and then there's fire everywhere. Such an iconic scene for the Super Nintendo and for gamers at that point. And then Final Fantasy II was another one. I remember playing, so I was a big Final Fantasy fan. I played Dragon Warrior again with my friend Dave, but for me, Final Fantasy, mostly due to Nintendo Power, Final Fantasy was the RPG that I was excited about and that I wanted to play. And I've talked about this in the Growing Up Gaming episode about the NES. But I was a big Final Fantasy fan. And so Final Fantasy II coming to Super Nintendo, I would say more than anything else, that was the game that made me kind of go, I kind of wish I'd held off and gotten a Super Nintendo instead of a Genesis, just because I was such a Final Fantasy nut, and knowing that the only way I was going to play Final Fantasy II was with a Super Nintendo. However, again, my best friend having one, we used to go rent games every weekend, and I remember we went and rented Final Fantasy II one Friday night, and we plugged that thing in when we got back to his place, and we did not sleep until we probably napped. We were handing off the controller back and forth, but we did not sleep until we rolled credits on that game. And it was a 2-day rental, and we took it back Sunday night, and I remember going back to our separate houses, and we both did the same thing. We just crashed until we had to get up and go to school on Monday morning. And it was the best experience ever. Final Fantasy II, the music was incredible. It was so narrative driven, which we had not seen previously. I mean, you know, all RPGs are narrative driven, obviously, but whereas like Final Fantasy 1 and Dragon Warrior both felt really basic. Phantasy Star 2 and 3, I think I'd played both at that point. Actually, I might not have played both of them by that point. So I feel like Final Fantasy 2, I'm using the North American numbering here, obviously, was the first time, like, it felt like a soap opera. It felt like anime. You know what I mean? It was so dramatic, and you had so many ebbs and flows in the story. You had characters leaving and coming back, and characters sacrificing themselves, and like the world changing around you, and the characters you met early in the game coming back later, and that sort of thing. And I remember going underground for the first time and realizing there was a whole world underground as well, and being amazed, and then getting, I think it was called the Whale, and then going to space, going up to the moon. Like, the game just felt so epic in a way that role-playing games up until that point, admittedly, I hadn't played a lot of them, but I'd played like the big ones up to that point, had never felt before. So, you know, we didn't put it down partially because we only had it for 2 days and we wanted to try to finish it, but we also didn't put it down because we couldn't put it down. We were so engaged, we were so invested in that narrative, and it was unreal. I think that, and now I'm looking at my notes here again, I keep coming up with early games. You might notice that I'm talking about a lot of early games, but I guess it's because even though I didn't have a Super Nintendo right from the start, some of my favorite memories of the Super Nintendo were playing with my best friend. Another early game that I count as one of my favorites, and that I don't hear a lot of people or see a lot of people talk about, but I think is definitely relevant, especially more recently now that Digital Eclipse has started doing their Gold Master series, is Konami's version of Prince of Persia on the system. To this day, my favorite way to play Prince of Persia. That was on pretty much every console under the sun, plus on the PC. I love the Super Nintendo version of Prince of Persia. Still my favorite way to play that game. Another great soundtrack. And the other thing that I'm sort of realizing as I'm saying this, and I realized previously when I was going back and sort of testing some of the games that I felt were the key games for the Super Nintendo, is that the Super Nintendo has a great library. It's revered for very good reason. But when I look at my preferences and the games that I loved on the system, pretty much if it didn't come from Square, Capcom, Konami, or Nintendo, I wasn't really playing it. But that made sense because it really was, to me, the Super Nintendo was the continuation of what was on the NES. And I think that it was a massive boon for the Super Nintendo. But I also think that it was a bit of an anchor around Nintendo as well, because if you look back, and this is absolutely the case, and I remember these news stories happening at the time, the success of the NES, actually, I think, while it helped Nintendo, it actually was a burden when the Super Nintendo came out, because you had people who had invested so much time and money into the NES, especially parents with their children, who were being told, oh, by the way, nothing is backwards compatible. Your big Nintendo collection, none of that's going to work on the Super Nintendo. Give us more money. And I mean, that's a sort of a naive way to look at it by today's standards, but it was absolutely a thing back then, especially where the gaming industry was so much smaller than it is now, and wasn't necessarily understood by the majority of the sort of working class adult public at that point. They had played arcade games, they had played the Atari and everything, but it was, the NES was definitely the kids' domain for the most part. Not saying adults didn't play it, but way more kids played it, and of course they didn't have the disposable income. So I remember, and I may have mentioned this in the Genesis video, but I remember, I think it was Al Nilsson saying that the power base converter for the Genesis was one of the best peripherals they ever created that didn't sell, because the Master System wasn't nearly as popular. I think it was like 5% of the market as opposed to like the 95 or 90% that Nintendo had with the NES. But whenever someone complained about their NES library not working on the Super Nintendo, Sega could point to the power base converter and say, well, Master System games work on the Genesis. But anyway, but it did feel like a continuation of the greatest parts of playing on the NES, and a lot of that had to do with the fact that a lot of the biggest third parties and Nintendo itself were making bigger, bolder, louder versions of the games that were super popular on that system. That's where you were getting all those sequels. And you weren't really getting them on the Genesis. Not for the first couple of years anyway. Eventually you did, but you weren't in 91 and 92. When did I was trying to think. I keep looking over there because my notes are over there. I'm actually going to take a drink real quick. I'm trying to think when I actually purchased my Super Nintendo. And I'll be honest, I can't remember. I know I did eventually get one. I want to say it would have been probably 93, maybe 94. While I had played a bunch of Super Nintendo games, again, via my friendship with Dave, I didn't own one myself. So there were definitely a lot of games that I was missing out on and have missed out on over the years on the Super Nintendo. I mean, I did have access to it. We did rent a lot of them. I did play a lot of them at the game store I mentioned before in a previous video, Game World, because they had a Super Nintendo on demo. I remember playing the Super Nintendo version of Mortal Kombat and the Super Nintendo version of Smash TV and NBA Jam and, that sort of thing. I didn't touch a lot of early Super Nintendo shooters. I had mentioned this in a previous episode of Player One Podcast, actually, where I missed out on a lot of the early shooters. I didn't play Gradius 3 or R-Type or UN Squadron, which I think is one that I should try to get back and play. Because, first of all, I didn't have a Super Nintendo, and second of all, I had a Genesis. And the shooters on the Genesis, I thought, were better. They played better, they didn't have as much slowdown. Why would I play those three when I could play Thunder Force 3 or Musha or Gyarados or something like that? So, definitely a blind spot in my system history, my console history as far as the Super Nintendo goes. But I remember finally getting pushed to get a Super Nintendo, I'm going to say it was either Final Fantasy III or a combination of Final Fantasy III and Donkey Kong Country. I can't remember which one came first. I was definitely more excited about Final Fantasy III. As much as I said that Final Fantasy II, and again I'm using the North American numbering system here, that Final Fantasy II felt epic, I would say that Final Fantasy III felt theatrical, is the only way I can describe it. For as amazing a leap Final Fantasy II was over 1 here in North America, Final Fantasy III was, I'd say, the exact same leap. You had that cold open where you had the 3 mechs walking towards a distant town in 3D, in the dark, in the snow, with this amazing score playing underneath it and credits rolling like you would see in the opening of a film. Again, you had worlds opening up, you had a world getting destroyed, you had the amazing opera scene, which I think even today it's really hard to find anything that compares to that. Especially, the impact that it had back then. You had the players coming in and out of the party again. A lot of the special abilities that the players had were ratcheted up. I mean, you had one character, was it Sabin, I think, who could actually do like Street Fighter style moves. You had the great flashbacks, like you had issues like the Ghost Train, and you had great villains like Kefka and the octopus whose name I can't remember now, but kept popping up in the game. It was incredible. But to me, one of the big things was the score, the music was amazing. And by the mid-90s, I definitely remember having my own TV in my room. So I was playing these games in my room at this point, because up until probably I got a little bit after I got a Genesis, if I was playing games, I was playing them on the television in the front room. And so I was playing them when my dad wasn't watching TV, which was not very frequent, or I was playing them at my friend's place, because he did have a TV in his room. But I do remember at some point I had a television in my room. And it was, like I think a 21-inch color TV. I can't believe I actually called out that it was color, but I'm not that old. But yes, it was a color TV. And I had gotten a Sega CD, which is the next video, probably going to be the next video in this series. And because of the Red Book audio and just the general audio quality hike at that point, I had actually bought myself a little stereo system that I could plug my game consoles into and listen to them through, my stereo speakers. And I remember I'm pretty sure Final Fantasy III was the first time that I really cared about doing that with a Super Nintendo. And I'm pretty sure that was the game that convinced me to get a Super Nintendo. But I say that it might have been Donkey Kong Country as well, because I think even through having a Genesis, I kept my Nintendo Power subscription. And so, if you remember, if you had Nintendo Power back then, I mean, Donkey Kong Country was being pushed hard. And I remember getting the VHS tape that people who were around then will remember. It was shipped in a green box, printed with the CGI leaves that made up the jungle scenes in Donkey Kong Country. And it was like a making of thing. I don't know that it were making of. I don't think they ever really talked to anybody at Rare. I think it was just some like standard 90s MTV style presenter walking around through Nintendo of America and talking to them about Donkey Kong Country and giving you a really good look at it. And I was hooked on that. That worked on me so much. I had to have that game. So, again, I don't know if I had a Super Nintendo at that point, because I think that was 94. And so if I didn't, that definitely helped push me over the edge on that too. And I feel like I'm not going to sit here and say Donkey Kong Country was an amazing game. I don't think it was amazing. I think it was a pretty competent platformer. I think it had gorgeous music. I think it had beautiful graphics for the time. The character designs, I can take or leave. I've never been a huge fan of Rare's big googly eye style, but the fully rendered CGI sprites that, of course, they were crushed down and lower frame rate and everything for the game. They looked fantastic on a CRT. They don't look good now. If you play those games on a modern monitor, they don't look good because you're not getting, the resolution is too high, and you're not getting sort of the softness that you got out of a CRT. You're not getting the scan lines, and you're not getting, I'm going to call it smearing for lack of a better term, but you're not getting the blending, I guess I should say, of colors between pixels that added a layer of color depth and shading and lighting that it's really hard to replicate on a modern display. So it makes the game look really ugly. When I go back and play it nowadays, and again, there's probably footage running over this right now, I think the game looks ugly now. It did not look ugly in 1994. It looked cutting edge in 1994 on a decent CRT. It was gorgeous, and I remember again playing it on the stereo system like I was doing with my Sega CD games, like I did with Final Fantasy III, and just being amazed at the quality of the audio in that game, especially the underwater scenes. The underwater score in Donkey Kong Country is some of the most beautiful video game music ever created, as far as I'm concerned. So yeah, it was either just Final Fantasy III or it was Final Fantasy III and Donkey Kong Country that kind of got me into actually buying a Super Nintendo. I have one other story that kind of came up, or that sort of bubbled up from my memory when I was preparing for this video, and that is, and I don't talk about this too much because I haven't played these games in a really long time. I'm kind of generally disgusted by how Star Citizen has gone with Chris Roberts and the Kickstarter and how much money they've spent, and Squadron 42 hasn't come out yet as of this video. I wish I had my $100 back, but I am and was a huge Wing Commander fan. I remember seeing Wing Commander playing on display units, like display computers at Radio Shack in, what year did that come out? 1990, I think? And being amazed by it. But I hadn't really played it. And there was a local rental place, and I think back about this now and don't understand how or why I ever did this. But there was a local video game rental place about a kilometer away from here that I would go. I forget what it was called at the time. It was eventually called Ben's Video, because one of the guys who worked there took it over and renamed it after himself. His name was Ben. But anyway, it wasn't called Ben's Video at the time. But it was a rental store, a little rental store that I would go to rent movies and to rent Nintendo games. And they had Super Nintendo. I don't think they had Genesis. And I remember going in, and there was another guy. I don't know if he was the owner or if he was just the manager. It wasn't Ben, because Ben and I got really close. And if this had been Ben, it wouldn't have been so weird. But anyway, he was always sitting in a little room with the desk in front of him where you would check out. You bring the movies up, and of course this was the room that had all the movies and everything, the cases in the back on the shelves. And of course in there he had a little TV that he would either generally be watching movies on or playing video games. And I remember going in one day, and the TV was mounted up high, so he would stand up when he was playing things. And he was standing there holding a Super Nintendo controller. And there was somebody else back there with him. And they were marveling over some game he was playing. And again, I don't know why I thought this was okay, but for some reason I decided because there was someone else back there, it was okay for me to walk around the counter and see what they were playing. And so I did. I walked around the counter and I looked up and he was playing Wing Commander on the Super Nintendo, which was, I think, the first I'd heard that Wing Commander was available on the Super Nintendo. And I remember seeing it and going in and saying something like, oh, that's really cool. And both of them looking at me and him going, what the hell are you doing back here? Get out of here. And started chasing me. He didn't chase me out of the store because I think he knew I was still a paying customer, that I was going to rent something. But he did chase me out from behind the counter. I don't know why I did that. And it's a weird story. And it doesn't really lead anywhere other than to say that the Super Nintendo is where I first played Wing Commander, which is important for later on because it's also the reason why I really, really, really wanted to play Wing Commander 3 and decided the only way to do that was to play it on a 3DO, which I could trade in for, as opposed to, I couldn't trade all the video game stuff I owned for a PC that would run Wing Commander 3. So I decided to get it on a 3DO by trading in all my stuff for a 3DO. But that's a future episode. But yeah, Wing Commander 3, one of my favorite Super Nintendo games. And one of my favorite game series, and it was because of the Super Nintendo. I do want to also mention, just in passing, that at the time it came out, I didn't necessarily think the Super Nintendo was ugly, but I never thought it was very attractive looking either. It's very boxy, but not boxy in like an NES way. And to me, it feels big and empty, and the cartridges don't really fit in it properly. There's so much extra space around the cartridges when you plug them in. Like, it looks like they're not built for the system. And of course, that's always sort of been a thing because the Super Famicom, which I didn't bring out my Super Famicom here, but if you've ever held one, it's a very compact system. The cartridges slide in there beautifully, and they fit in there really snugly. Like, it looks designed to do what it does. Whereas the Super Nintendo, it doesn't. It's got that big ugly eject button, and like I said, it's just big and boxy. The back of the system is really long for some reason. I don't know why. And it's been much maligned over the years, and I have to say that I agree with it, but I also understand why Nintendo did it. You know, if you remember when they came back, when they were bringing out the NES, the whole idea was that they didn't want it to look like a toy. They wanted it to look like more of a television component. And so I believe that was actually the guideline that was given to, I forget the name of the guy who's taking credit for the Super Nintendo redesign, but that was kind of his guideline as well. It was just like, you know, we don't want it to look like a toy. We want it to look a little bit more sleek, and I guess they felt like the Super Famicom at the time just looked like kind of a lump of gray plastic. They also wanted it to fit on... The idea was that the system was going to be modular, much like the the Genesis and the Sega CD ended up being, where if you look at the Sega CD design, and again, we'll talk about this in the next video, but if you look at it, it sits on top of the Genesis sits on top of the Sega CD, and all the lines are perfect. It looks great. And my understanding is that they didn't feel at Nintendo of America, or at least this guy didn't feel that little lump of gray plastic would look great sitting on top of other components. Because, again, the idea was it was going to be modular. Be that as it may, it wasn't a pretty system, which was weird, but it didn't have to be either. But what I will say, and what I will defend till the end of time, is the, I don't know what is this, indigo? Or, I mean, it's purple lilac, I guess. The color scheme, I've heard a lot of people, this is a great controller, by the way, I've heard a lot of people, sort of crap all over the fact that they got rid of the multicolored buttons on the Super Famicom controller, which, don't get me wrong, the Super Famicom controller buttons, the controllers in general are very pretty. I love the color scheme that they went with for the Super Nintendo. So much so that for the longest time, like, anything purple or remotely purple, that was the Nintendo color. And if you look in, like, during my run at EGM, because we got to a point where we were color coding the reviews, the text on the reviews and the title bars, and also the previews and everything, purple was the Nintendo color. Now that had to do, of course, with the the GameCube also being purple, and not the first Game Boy Color, but the Game Boy Color, one of the Game Boy Color colors being purple, which mine is right back, or indigo, I guess you can say, which mine is right back there. That was the Nintendo Color, and I was kind of sad to see them go away from that with the Wii and the Wii U and subsequent systems. But yeah, as much as I'd say that the industrial redesign of the Super Nintendo is ugly, I also have to say that the color scheme that they went with for the Super Nintendo, I dig. I'm all for it. I was all for it. As far as what kind of impact the Super Nintendo may or may not have had, I mean, on my life as a gamer, well, look at it this way. I really revere the early 90s. The 90s in general, in video games. It was such an exciting time. There were so many big advances being made. There were so many experimental games coming out. There was a lot of experimental hardware coming out. There was sort of the specter of multimedia and the question of what that was going to mean for gaming and what kind of impact it was going to have. And games were really evolving in the 90s, and they were evolving from children's toys. I mean, I know it's kind of naive to say it that way because, I mean, they've been around since, like, the consumer games have been around since, like, the 70s, and it wasn't just kids that were playing it. But really, I think, realistically, the 80s, the late 80s especially, and with the NES, and to a much lesser degree, the Master System, they had been kids' toys. They were marketed as such for good reason, and they were definitely in the domain of they were in the child's domain. That started to shift with the Genesis and with the Super Nintendo. They were going after an older audience. I think the other thing too for me is that I was the perfect age for that. Like, by the time the Genesis came out, I was a teenager. So I was a teenager all through the Genesis and Super Nintendo years and going up into the PlayStation and Saturn and N64. But I mean, that was an exciting time. Every new bit of hardware was a huge leap forward, which you really don't really get that much anymore. And the other thing that I loved about the 90s was that every system really had personality. I constantly say, like, you know when you're playing a Genesis game by the way it looks or sounds. Same with the Super Nintendo, and that carried on, and the TurboGrafx, and that carried on with the Saturn and PlayStation and N64. You know, the controllers were pretty different for the most part. They were distinct for their systems. Even as they evolved and started to kind of homogenize a little bit. Homogenize? Anyway. One of those H words. But the Super Nintendo was a huge part of that. The impact that it had on me as a gamer, I don't know that it had anything specific. Like, I don't think there was any specific impact from a standpoint of, I can trace my love of this, well, besides Wing Commander, I can trace my love of this directly to the Super Nintendo, or the Super Nintendo's the reason I decided to write about video games for a living, or wanted to design games for a living, or something like that. But it was just a huge part in general of defining me as a gamer in the early 90s, as I think it was for anybody my age or anybody who was around in the early 90s. Probably much more so than the Genesis for most people. So, I mean, it was a huge part of who I was. It was also the first time, it was the first system that I ever bought that made me sort of a multi-system gamer. Like, up until that point, we had a 2600. We didn't have a Commodore 64 or ColecoVision or Intellivision. Before and after that, we had an NES. We didn't have a Master System. And then, you know, I got rid of my NES to get a Genesis. So I was, as I got old enough to be sort of in control of what we had in the house and what I was playing my games on, I was still sort of a single system user until about midway through the Super Nintendo's life. And then realizing that I wanted to be a multi-system user, and I've never looked back. There's never been a generation since then that I haven't bought the major consoles. So I guess now when I'm saying this, or, you know, as I'm speaking these words, I'm realizing that's the impact that the Super Nintendo had on me. it strengthened friendships that I had with some of my friends. One friend in particular, my friend Dave in particular, who's still a lifelong friend to this day. But our relationship sort of built on playing Nintendo games together, and got that much stronger playing Super Nintendo games together. So I think that that's a huge impact as well. But yeah, me as a gamer, and which of course ties directly into me and my professional life, I'd say the Super Nintendo's impact was that I needed to have it, even though I had decided I didn't need to have it by 1991 because I was tired of waiting for it. It was such an amazing system. It was such a landmark gaming system that I didn't see a way not to have it. I needed to experience the games that were on it. So I'd say that's the impact that it's had on me. So that's where I'm going to leave this sort of retrospective on my memories and my experience with the Super Nintendo. I really hope you've been enjoying these videos. I believe the response to them has been great, which I'm so excited about. The Genesis video has created a lot of conversation in the comments section, which I absolutely love. So please continue to do that. Please leave your comments below. When did you get a Super Nintendo? What were your favorite games? What kind of impact did it have on you? Were you a multi-game system owner as well? And sort of, what led you to do that? And anything else you want to talk about, please consider leaving a comment in the section below. Please consider liking the video. I hope you subscribe, and I hope you would also consider supporting the show on patreon.com/Seward. Thank you so much for your time. Thank you for listening to me. I hope you were entertained. I hope this triggers some memories of your own and was a nice trip down memory lane for you as well. I will be back with the next episode of Growing Up Gaming. I believe it will be about the Sega CD, but who knows? I've got some other things cooking. It might be something else. We'll see. In the meantime, stay safe, be kind to everyone, and hope to see you again soon. Goodbye.